July 5, 1852. Corinthian Hall, Rochester, New York. Frederick Douglass stood backstage, listening to the crowd settle into their seats. 500 white citizens gathered to celebrate American independence. They had invited him, the famous black orator who had escaped bondage 16 years earlier, expecting gratitude, expecting patriotism, expecting him to praise the nation that had declared all men created equal while millions remained in chains. Douglass had other plans. The Rochester Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society had extended the invitation weeks earlier, asking him to speak at their Independence Day celebration. The request seemed straightforward: deliver an uplifting address about freedom, democracy, and the promise of America. Stand before the white elite of Rochester and honor the Founding Fathers. Celebrate July 4th as a triumph of liberty. But Douglass understood what they didn't. He had no July 4th to celebrate. For him, for 4 million black Americans still bound in the South, Independence Day was a mockery. Every cannon fired in celebration, every toast raised to freedom, every speech praising American liberty, all of it hollow, all of it built on a foundation of human suffering. The organizers expected a formerly enslaved man to thank America for its ideals. Douglass was about to prosecute America for its crimes. He heard his name called. The applause began. Polite, anticipatory, comfortable. The audience settled in for what they assumed would be an inspiring, safe speech. They had no idea what was coming. Douglass stepped onto the stage, looked out at the sea of white faces, and prepared to ask the question that would shatter their celebration. What to the enslaved person is the 4th of July? The invitation had arrived weeks earlier at Frederick Douglass's home on Alexander Street in Rochester. The Rochester Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society requested his presence at their Independence Day celebration at Corinthian Hall. Would the famous orator honor them with an address celebrating American liberty and the promise of freedom? It was a prestigious request. Douglass had lived in Rochester for 5 years by 1852, establishing himself as the most powerful black voice in America. His newspaper, The North Star, reached thousands. His autobiography had sold tens of thousands of copies. White abolitionists across the North respected him as living proof that formerly enslaved people possessed intellect, eloquence, and moral authority equal to any white man. But respect had limits. Even sympathetic white audiences expected Douglass to stay within boundaries, to criticize slavery, yes, but to praise American ideals, to condemn the South while celebrating the North, to acknowledge progress and express gratitude for white allies. The formula was clear: be inspiring, not threatening; be grateful, not angry. The Rochester elite considered themselves progressive. They had invited Douglass to speak, after all. Many were abolitionists who genuinely opposed bondage. They donated to anti-slavery causes, attended lectures, and believed themselves morally superior to Southern enslavers. Their city had become a hub of reform movements: women's rights, temperance, anti-slavery activism. Rochester saw itself as enlightened, forward-thinking, a beacon of northern virtue. That self-image was about to be shattered. The audience filling Corinthian Hall on July 5th expected a celebration. They anticipated hearing about the Founding Fathers' wisdom, the Declaration of Independence's noble promises, and America's march toward fulfilling its destiny. Perhaps Douglass would criticize slavery in the abstract, condemn the South's brutality, and praise Northern virtue. He might call for gradual reform or appeal to American conscience. What they absolutely did not expect was prosecution. They didn't anticipate being called hypocrites, criminals, or worse than savages. They couldn't imagine a formerly enslaved man looking them in the eye and declaring their celebration a sham, their liberty a mockery, their prayers and hymns mere fraud and deception. The conventional wisdom was simple. Grateful black speakers praised America for its ideals while lamenting slavery as a temporary contradiction soon to be resolved. They thanked white allies, acknowledged progress, and expressed hope. They performed gratitude. Douglass had performed gratitude for years. He'd given hundreds of speeches following the expected formula. White audiences loved him because he proved their theories, that education and opportunity could elevate the formerly enslaved, that abolition was morally righteous, that America's promise would eventually include everyone. But the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had changed everything. That federal law turned every northern city into hunting ground for enslavers seeking to recapture people who had escaped. It made every white citizen a potential collaborator in bondage. It proved that slavery wasn't just a Southern problem, it was an American institution protected by Northern complicity. Douglass was done performing gratitude. The audience at Corinthian Hall expected the Frederick Douglass they knew, inspiring, measured, hopeful. They were about to meet a different man entirely. Douglass began carefully. He opened with praise for the Founding Fathers, their courage, their vision, their willingness to stand against tyranny. The audience relaxed. This was familiar territory. This was the Douglass they expected. He spoke of the Declaration of Independence as a saving document, its principles worth defending. Heads nodded. This felt safe. Then came the pivot. Fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? His tone shifted. The warmth drained from his voice. What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? The question hung in the air like smoke. The audience stirred uncomfortably. Are the great principles of political freedom and natural justice, embodied in that Declaration of Independence, extended to us? Douglass's voice grew harder. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The shift was seismic. This wasn't gratitude. This wasn't celebration. This was accusation. The blessings in which you, this day, rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. His words struck like hammer blows. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. Then came the devastating question that would echo through American history. What to the enslaved person is the 4th of July? The audience froze. Some shifted in their seats. Others stared, unable to process what was happening. This wasn't the speech they had prepared for. This was something else entirely. Douglass answered his own question with fury. To him, your celebration is a sham. You boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. He wasn't finished. The words came faster, sharper, each one a blood. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. The accusation was complete, not gradual criticism, not gentle reform, total moral prosecution. Douglass had called white America worse than savages. He had named their prayers fraud and their liberty mockery. He had turned their Independence Day into evidence of their guilt. The formerly enslaved man they invited to celebrate had instead put them on trial, and he was just getting started. Douglass didn't retreat. He pressed forward, building his case against American hypocrisy with surgical precision. For over an hour, he systematically dismantled every pillar of white America's self-image, using their own documents, their own Bible, their own Constitution as weapons against them. He detailed the horrors with unflinching clarity. Black men and women hunted like animals, families torn apart at auction blocks, children ripped from mothers' arms and sold to distant plantations, never to be seen again. People beaten, branded, worked to death in southern fields, while northern merchants grew rich from the cotton they produced. The audience squirmed, but Douglass refused to soften the truth. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour, he declared. Not the South alone, the United States, the entire nation stood condemned. He turned their religious piety against them. Churches that preach Christian love while defending bondage, ministers who bless the chains, congregations that sang hymns on Sunday and returned human beings to captivity on Monday through the Fugitive Slave Act. Your prayers and hymns, he repeated, mere bombast, fraud, deception. Then came the Constitution. White Americans loved to cite the founding document as proof of their nation's virtue. Douglass knew it better than most of them. He quoted it back to them, showing how they violated their own principles. The document said nothing about race determining freedom. It was Americans who had twisted its meaning to justify the unjustifiable. He invoked the Declaration of Independence, those soaring words about all men being created equal. Are these principles extended to us? He demanded. The silence in Corinthian Hall was answer enough. No, they were not. Black Americans were excluded from the all men the founders had proclaimed. That exclusion was the crime Douglass prosecuted. His rhetoric escalated. I will not equivocate, I will not excuse, he thundered, echoing the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. I will use the severest language I can command. And he did. Every sentence struck like a whip. Every paragraph was an indictment. He called for upheaval, not patience. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake, he declared. Gentle reform wouldn't save the nation. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. The formerly enslaved man they had invited to praise America had instead become its fiercest prosecutor. He stood before them, using language as a weapon more devastating than any cannon fired on Independence Day. The celebration they planned had become a trial, and every person in that hall understood they had been found guilty. The silence in Corinthian Hall was absolute. 500 white Americans sat frozen, processing what had just happened. They had invited Frederick Douglass to celebrate their freedom. Instead, he had prosecuted them for their crimes, called their prayers fraud, named their celebration a sham, declared them worse than savages. Some audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared at Douglass with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to fury. This wasn't how Independence Day speeches were supposed to go. This wasn't the grateful, measured critique they had anticipated. This was something far more dangerous. A formerly enslaved man refusing to perform gratitude, refusing to soften his words, refusing to make white comfort his priority. The Rochester Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society members who had invited Douglass exchanged glances. They were abolitionists, yes, but even they hadn't expected this level of fury. They believed in ending bondage through moral persuasion and gradual reform. Douglass had just called for storms, whirlwinds, and earthquakes. He had demanded the nation's conscience be roused and its hypocrisy exposed without mercy. But something remarkable happened in that stunned silence. The audience didn't riot. They didn't storm out. They didn't demand he stop speaking. Because despite the harsh words, or perhaps because of them, they recognized the truth in what Douglass said. The abolitionist audience knew American hypocrisy existed. They had seen it in the Fugitive Slave Act, forcing them to become complicit in bondage. They had witnessed it in churches that blessed chains. They understood that gentle speeches praising gradual progress hadn't freed a single person. Douglass ended with a note of hope, carefully calculated. After spending an hour demolishing American moral pretensions, he pivoted. I do not despair of this country, he declared. There were forces working toward the downfall of bondage. The Constitution, properly understood, was an anti-slavery document. Change was possible, but only through confrontation, not comfort. The speech concluded. Applause erupted. Not universal, not comfortable, but real. Some clapped because they agreed completely. Others clapped because they recognized they had witnessed something historic, even if it made them deeply uncomfortable. A formerly enslaved man had stood before white America and spoken truth with power they couldn't ignore. Within days, the speech was published as a pamphlet titled Oration Delivered in Corinthian Hall, Rochester. Copies circulated across the North, carried by abolitionists eager to spread Douglass's words. Newspapers covered it, some praising his courage, others condemning his extremism. Pro-slavery publications used it as evidence that Black Americans were ungrateful and dangerous. Abolitionists cited it as proof that moral compromise with bondage was impossible. The audience that day understood they had witnessed a turning point. Douglass hadn't just given a speech, he had redefined the terms of debate. No more polite requests for gradual emancipation, no more gratitude for small mercies. The formerly enslaved man they invited to praise America had instead demanded America live up to its own stated ideals, or admit those ideals were lies. The celebration they planned had become a reckoning, and there was no going back. Within hours of stepping down from the stage at Corinthian Hall, Frederick Douglass's speech began its transformation from local oration to national phenomenon. The Rochester Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society immediately understood what they had witnessed, not just another anti-slavery address, but a complete reframing of how Black Americans could speak to white power. They moved quickly to publish the full text. Within weeks, Oration, delivered in Corinthian Hall, Rochester, appeared as a pamphlet, printed by Lee, Mann and Company. Copies flew across the North, passed hand to hand among abolitionists who recognized its power. This wasn't the typical moral appeal asking white Americans to be kinder. This was prosecution, delivered with intellectual force that couldn't be dismissed or patronized. Newspapers picked up the story. Abolitionist publications praised Douglass's courage and clarity. The National Anti-Slavery Standard ran extensive excerpts. The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's influential paper, featured the speech prominently. Abolitionists who had spent years making careful, measured arguments suddenly had a weapon, a formerly enslaved man's voice, cutting through every excuse and evasion white America used to justify bondage. Pro-slavery newspapers reacted with fury, exactly as Douglass expected. Southern editors used the speech as evidence that Black Americans were ungrateful, dangerous, and incapable of appreciating Northern generosity. They claimed it proved education and freedom only created radicals who threatened social order. Their outrage validated everything Douglass had said about American hypocrisy. But the speech's impact went beyond immediate reactions. It fundamentally shifted the terms of abolitionist discourse. Before July 5, 1852, many white abolitionists spoke about bondage as a moral failing that could be corrected through gradual reform and moral persuasion. They emphasized patience, compromise, and working within existing political structures. Douglass had obliterated that framework. His speech demonstrated that polite requests for incremental change were themselves a form of complicity. By turning Independence Day into an indictment, he showed that American celebrations of freedom were offensive performances as long as millions remained in chains. The formerly enslaved man they invited to participate in their holiday had instead exposed the holiday itself as hypocrisy. The speech became required reading in abolitionist circles. It was reprinted multiple times over the following years. Douglass himself included it in his 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, ensuring it reached even wider audiences. The central question, what to the enslaved person is the 4th of July, became a rallying cry, repeated in speeches, pamphlets, and debates across the North. Rochester itself was transformed by the address. The city that had invited Douglass as a celebrated but ultimately non-threatening figure now understood. They lived alongside someone who would never soften his message for white comfort. Douglass remained in Rochester for years afterward, his newspaper The North Star continuing to publish challenging, uncompromising critiques of American society. The speech cemented his position as the most powerful Black voice in America, not because white audiences found him comforting, but because they couldn't ignore his intellectual and moral authority. The July 5, 1852 speech didn't just shake Rochester, it became one of the most important orations in American history, studied and referenced for over 170 years. What Frederick Douglass delivered that day transcended the moment, creating a template for how marginalized voices could confront power with moral authority and intellectual force that couldn't be dismissed. The speech was reprinted continuously throughout the 1850s as tensions over bondage escalated towards civil war. Abolitionists distributed copies at rallies, conventions, and meetings across the North. The central question, "What to the enslaved person is the 4th of July?" became a rallying cry that exposed American hypocrisy more effectively than thousands of polite appeals for gradual reform. Douglass had proven that confrontation, not comfort, moved hearts and minds. When the Civil War finally came in 1861, Douglass's words seemed prophetic. He had called for storms, whirlwinds, and earthquakes to shake the nation's conscience, and that's exactly what happened. The war that ended bondage validated everything he had said 9 years earlier about moral compromise being impossible. America couldn't gradually reform its way out of the crisis. It required upheaval. After emancipation, the speech took on new meaning. During Reconstruction and beyond, Black Americans and their allies cited Douglass's 1852 address as proof that the struggle for true equality required more than legal freedom. The hypocrisy Douglass identified, celebrating liberty while denying it to millions, didn't end with the 13th Amendment. His framework applied to segregation, discrimination, and systemic racism that persisted for generations. The speech became required reading in American schools by the 20th century, studied alongside the Declaration of Independence and the Gettysburg Address as foundational texts of American identity. Scholars recognized it as a masterpiece of rhetoric. The way Douglass opened with praise before pivoting to prosecution, how he used the audience's own documents against them, his careful balance of fury and hope. Students learned that great speeches don't just persuade, they redefine the terms of debate entirely. Civil rights leaders in the 1950s and 1960s drew directly on Douglass's approach. When Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of America's promissory note that had come back marked insufficient funds, he was echoing Douglass's strategy of holding America accountable to its own stated ideals. When Malcolm X questioned what Independence Day meant to Black Americans still facing systemic oppression, he channeled Douglass's refusal to celebrate freedom that wasn't universal. Today, the speech remains astonishingly relevant. Every July, excerpts are read at commemorations across America. In 1920, descendants of Frederick Douglass recorded readings that went viral, introducing new generations to his words. The speech is taught in literature classes, history courses, rhetoric seminars, and political science programs as an example of how language can be wielded as a weapon for justice. Rochester, the city that hosted Douglass for 25 years, now celebrates him as its most important historical figure. The speech he delivered at Corinthian Hall transformed not just that audience of 500, but generations of Americans who learned that patriotism sometimes requires prosecuting your country's failures, not just celebrating its promises. Douglass showed that a formerly enslaved man, armed with truth, could become judge, prosecutor, and moral authority over the nation that had once claimed to own him, and that legacy endures.